The funeral flowers were still fresh on Marcus Webb's grave when the letters started arriving. Amelia Webb had spent 11 years being the quiet wife in the background. She managed the household, kept the schedules, and learned early on that her husband preferred her invisible. She had accepted that role the way you accept bad weather, not happily, but without fighting it. Marcus was charming in public and cold at home, and somewhere between those two versions of him, Amelia had stopped expecting much from life. She was 38 years old, overweight in a way that strangers felt entitled to comment on, and now she was a widow. She had assumed grief would be her biggest problem. She was wrong. The first letter came 3 days after the burial. It was from a financial firm she had never heard of, referencing a business loan she didn't know existed. The second letter came the following morning, then a third. By the end of the week, Amelia had a stack of documents spread across her kitchen table that told a story Marcus had carefully hidden from her for years. Her husband had borrowed heavily. Shipping contracts, warehouse leases, equipment financing, all of it signed under Webb Logistics, the small freight company Marcus had built before they married. The debts were enormous, and under Illinois law, as the estate's sole heir, she was now attached to every single one of them. She hired a lawyer with the last of her savings. He sat across from her with the kind of expression doctors use before delivering bad news, and he told her plainly that the estate didn't have enough to cover what was owed. Several creditors had already begun proceedings. She could fight it, he said, but fighting cost money she didn't have. Then, 4 days later, everything shifted. Her lawyer called on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice carrying a new tension she hadn't heard before. One entity had purchased the majority of the outstanding debt, all of it consolidated under a single buyer overnight. The move was unusual, he said, aggressive. Someone had specifically sought out Marcus Webb's debt and acquired it quietly before anyone else could act. The buyer was Brooks Logistics Group. Amelia knew that name. Everyone in Chicago's freight and shipping world knew that name. Brooks Logistics was one of the largest privately held transportation companies in the Midwest. It wasn't publicly traded, didn't advertise, and kept its internal operations tightly guarded. What it was known for, in the way that powerful things become known, was its owner, Ethan Brooks. She had heard the stories. 34 years old and already running a company with operations in 11 states. Some people called him a genius. Others used different words. The kind of man who acquired things, companies, contracts, debts, and always had a reason that wasn't immediately obvious. There were rumors, the kind that circulated at industry events and got quieter whenever someone important walked into the room. She had never met him personally, but his reputation alone made her hands unsteady as she read the letter requesting her presence at the Brooks Logistics headquarters downtown. She almost didn't go. She sat in her car outside the glass tower on Michigan Avenue for 6 minutes, telling herself she could turn around. Nobody could physically force her through those doors. But the lawyer had been clear. Ignoring the summons would accelerate proceedings against the estate. She had no good options, only less bad ones. The lobby was cold and immaculate. A woman at the front desk directed her to the 41st floor without looking up from her screen. The elevator ride felt longer than it was. Amelia straightened her black dress, the same one she'd worn to the funeral, and reminded herself to breathe. The office she was shown into was not what she expected. No mahogany desk, no trophy wall, no performance of power. It was a working space, whiteboards covered in logistics diagrams, stacked binders, 3 open laptops on a long table. The man standing near the window turned when she entered, and for a moment, she simply registered the details. Tall, dark-haired, younger-looking than she'd imagined, wearing a plain dark shirt with the sleeves pushed to his elbows. Ethan Brooks looked at her the way people rarely did, without sliding his gaze away the moment he'd taken stock of her size. "Mrs. Webb," he said, and gestured toward a chair at the table. "Thank you for coming." She sat. She waited. He didn't make her wait long. "I'm going to be straightforward with you," he said, settling into the chair across from her rather than behind a desk, which surprised her. "I have no interest in your home, your personal finances, or making your situation worse than it already is." "Then why buy the debt?" she asked, and was mildly surprised the words came out steady. "Because I need something that only you might be able to give me." He slid a folder across the table. "Your husband's company handled shipping records for several of our subsidiary contracts going back 6 years. Approximately $4 million worth of documentation has disappeared. Files, manifests, routing logs, gone. My team has spent 3 months trying to locate them and found nothing." Amelia opened the folder slowly. The records inside were formatted in a way that stopped her cold. She recognized the system immediately. The column headers, the shorthand notations in the margins, the way the dates were entered in a reversed format that looked like an error unless you knew otherwise. She had seen Marcus work this way at the kitchen table years ago, on evenings when he forgot she was in the room. She had even asked him about it once, and he'd brushed her off. But she had paid attention anyway, the way quiet people do when they have nothing else to do but observe. "I think I know how he organized these," she said quietly. Ethan Brooks went very still. "You do," he said. It wasn't a question. "These aren't deleted," Amelia said, studying the pages. "They're hidden. He built his own filing code. I've seen it before." The room was silent for a long moment. "Mrs. Webb," Ethan said carefully, "how soon can you start?" Amelia didn't go home that night with a clear head. She sat in her car in the parking garage beneath the Brooks building for almost 20 minutes, staring at the concrete wall in front of her. She had just told one of the most powerful men in Chicago that she could find $4 million worth of missing records, based on a filing system she had observed her late husband using at the kitchen table years ago on evenings when he hadn't noticed her watching. She hadn't promised results. She had simply told the truth. But somehow, saying it out loud in that office had made it feel like a commitment she now had to honor. She drove home, made tea she didn't drink, and spent the night going through every memory she had of watching Marcus work. By morning, she was more certain than afraid. She arrived at the Brooks headquarters at 8 the next day. A security badge was already waiting for her at the front desk, her name printed cleanly on it, her photo taken on the spot. She was shown to a mid-level office with a window, a long desk, and access to the company's archived digital filing system. The setup was more comfortable than she expected, and nobody stared at her for longer than a second. A woman appeared in the doorway shortly after Amelia settled in. She was sharp-featured, professionally dressed, and carrying a tablet she referenced constantly without looking at the screen. "Olivia Marsh," she said, extending a hand. "Director of Operations. Ethan asked me to walk you through what we have so far." Amelia shook her hand. "How much has your team already gone through?" "Everything we can access," Olivia said, pulling up a chair. 3 months of internal audits, 2 outside firms, 1 forensic IT consultant. All of them concluded the same thing. The files were either deleted or were never properly entered into the system in the first place. "They weren't deleted," Amelia said. Olivia looked at her with an expression that was carefully neutral. "What makes you say that?" "Because my husband never deleted anything," Amelia said, simply. "He was obsessive about keeping records. He just made them difficult for anyone else to find." She didn't say it with bitterness, though she felt some. Marcus had spent their entire marriage making things difficult to find, including himself. Olivia studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, tell me what you need." What Amelia needed was time and quiet, and Olivia gave her both. For the first 2 days, she did nothing but look. She moved through the archived system slowly, not searching for specific files, but instead learning the shape of how things were organized. Most of it followed standard industry formatting: dates, route numbers, carrier codes in predictable columns. But in certain folders, buried inside subdirectories with generic names like MISC 2018 and Archive Overflow, the formatting shifted slightly. The column spacing changed, the date entries were reversed, day before month before year, in a format that any automated system would flag as an error and quietly push to the bottom of search results. The carrier codes had an extra digit added at the front, a single number that appeared random but followed a rotating pattern. On the third day, she found the key. It was a document tucked inside a folder labeled Backup Templates, which any reasonable person would assume contained blank forms. Instead, it held a single spreadsheet with no title, no header, and no explanation. To anyone scanning quickly, it looked like corrupted data. To Amelia, looking at it through the lens of everything she'd observed, it was a translation guide. Marcus had built himself a personal cipher. Every route code corresponded to a real destination through a simple substitution method. Every reversed date could be corrected by applying a fixed offset he had noted in a column disguised as mileage data. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Her husband had been meticulous about hiding his professional world from her, but he had done some of that work at home, in rooms she passed through, on screens she occasionally glanced at. He had underestimated her the same way most people did, by assuming that because she was quiet, she wasn't paying attention. She printed the spreadsheet, locked it in the desk drawer Olivia had given her a key for, and went to find Ethan. He was in a glass-walled conference room with two men she didn't recognize, reviewing something on a large, wall-mounted screen. He saw her through the glass, said something brief to the others, and stepped out. "I found the decoding structure," she said, keeping her voice low. "The files aren't gone. They're in the system right now, sitting in subfolders that looked like junk. Your IT team would have skipped them because the formatting looks corrupted. It isn't." Ethan looked at her steadily. "Can you reconstruct them?" "I can. It'll take time. There are years of records and each entry needs to be manually translated and verified. But yes." He was quiet for a moment. Not the kind of quiet that meant doubt. The kind that meant he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "What do you need?" he asked. "A second workstation. Access to the original raw server data rather than the cleaned archive version, and someone from your IT team who can pull folders without reorganizing them first." She paused. "And I'd prefer if the number of people who know what I found stays small for now." Something shifted in his expression. "Why?" "Because someone at this company had access to Marcus's system and knew how it worked," she said. The files weren't buried by accident. They were hidden deliberately, after the fact. The hallway felt suddenly quieter. Ethan held her gaze. "You think someone inside the company did this?" "I think the records will tell us," Amelia said. "But yes, that's exactly what I think." The recovered cipher changed everything. Within 48 hours of Amelia's discovery, Ethan's IT team had pulled the raw server data and handed it to her without reorganizing a single folder. She worked through the files methodically, translating entries using the key Marcus had left behind, and slowly the missing records began to take shape. Most of what she recovered matched exactly what the company expected to find: standard shipping manifests, carrier confirmations, route logs. But one file stopped her cold. It was a manifest dated 14 months ago, referencing a warehouse location outside Milwaukee that didn't appear anywhere else in the Brooks logistics system. No contract number linked to it, no carrier assignment, just a location, a date, and a reference code that translated, through Marcus's cipher, to a phrase that made no immediate sense. She wrote it down and brought it to Ethan the following morning. He recognized the location immediately. "That's an old facility we stopped using 4 years ago," he said, studying the paper. "We kept the lease running for overflow storage, but no active operations run through it. Nobody should be logging shipments there." "Someone was," Amelia said. Caleb Torres, the company's head of logistics compliance, was brought in within the hour. He was younger than Amelia expected for the role, early 30s, precise in his movements, the kind of person who spoke in complete sentences and never repeated himself. He confirmed that the Milwaukee facility had been officially inactive since the company restructured its Midwest operations. No staff were assigned there. Access was restricted to senior executives, which made the manifest considerably more interesting. Ethan decided they would go themselves. No advance notice sent to the facility, no internal announcement. Just the four of them, Ethan, Amelia, Caleb, and Olivia, driving up to Milwaukee the next morning in a company vehicle with enough coffee to get through whatever they found. The facility sat on the western edge of the city, a long, flat building surrounded by a chain-link fence and very little else. The kind of place that looked permanently closed, even when it wasn't. Ethan used his executive keycard at the gate, and it opened without protest, which meant the security system was still active, and someone was still paying the electricity bill. Inside, the warehouse was cold and smelled of old cardboard and industrial grease. Rows of metal shelving stretched from floor to ceiling, most of them loaded with plastic-wrapped pallets that hadn't been touched in years. Dust covered everything with the particular thickness that comes from genuine long-term neglect. But not everywhere. Amelia noticed it first. Near the back of the building, 2 rows of shelving were notably cleaner than the rest. The dust on the floor in that section was disturbed, not recently, but within the past several months. The kind of disturbance left behind when things are moved and then carefully put back. Caleb began pulling the plastic wrap from the nearest pallet and found exactly what the manifest had suggested. Archived shipping records. Thousands of them, printed and boxed, going back years. Physical copies of documentation that should have existed only digitally in the company's system. They spent 4 hours going through the boxes. What they found was not simply a backup of existing records. These were originals. In several cases, the physical copies showed routing information that differed from what had been entered into the digital system. The same shipment, logged twice, with 2 different destinations. Amelia pulled one example and set it on a cleared shelf between herself and Ethan.
"Look at this,"
she said, pointing to 2 documents side by side.
"Same carrier, same date, same reference number. But the digital record shows this shipment going to a distribution center in Gary, Indiana. The physical copy shows it going somewhere else entirely."
Ethan looked at both documents without touching them. How many discrepancies like this are there? Caleb had already started counting. He looked up from a box of manifests with an expression that didn't carry good news. In just this section alone? Dozens. If the rest of these boxes follow the same pattern, we're looking at months of rerouted shipments. Olivia, who had been quiet for most of the morning, spoke from the end of the row.
"This isn't a records error,"
she said flatly.
"Someone has been systematically moving shipments off the official route logs and replacing the digital entries with false destinations."
For how long? Ethan asked. Based on the dates on these boxes, Amelia said, checking the labels carefully.
"At least 18 months.
The warehouse went quiet, except for the hum of the overhead lighting. Amelia understood now why the digital files had seemed so carefully hidden. The cipher, the buried folders, the corrupted formatting. It wasn't just Marcus organizing his work in an eccentric way. Someone had taken advantage of his personal system and used it as cover. By making the real records nearly impossible to find, they had bought themselves time. Months of it. She looked at the rows of shelving stretching ahead of them, calculating how long it would take to go through everything.
"We can't do this alone,"
she said.
"And we can't bring in a large team without tipping off whoever is responsible."
Ethan nodded slowly. Agreed. "There's something else," Caleb said, holding up a manifest from the bottom of the last box he'd searched. His voice had lost its usual evenness. "These rerouted shipments. I recognize some of these client codes. These aren't small accounts." He handed the document to Ethan, who scanned it once and handed it to Olivia. Olivia's expression didn't change, but she set the paper down with more care than necessary.
"If these clients find out their shipments were being altered without their knowledge,"
she said quietly,
"we won't have a records problem anymore.
She looked at Ethan directly.
We'll have a company problem."
The drive back to Chicago was almost entirely silent. Ethan made the call on Friday morning. No emails, no calendar invites, no internal announcements. He told Olivia and Caleb in person, separately, within the same hour. The message was simple. Pack for a weekend, bring only what you're working on, tell nobody where you're going. Then he stopped by Amelia's office doorway and said the same thing to her, adding only that the location had reliable internet and enough space for them to work without interruption. She packed a single bag that evening, moving through her quiet house with the particular awareness that comes from knowing you're about to leave a place that has stopped feeling like home. Marcus had been gone for 3 weeks, but his absence didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt more like the lifting of something she hadn't fully noticed she was carrying. The drive to Lake Geneva took just under 2 hours. Ethan drove, Caleb sat in front, and Amelia and Olivia shared the back seat with 2 boxes of files between them. Olivia spent most of the drive reading. Amelia watched the city give way to suburbs and then to open road, and thought about the physical manifests stacked in that Milwaukee warehouse, and the 18 months of shipments that had quietly gone somewhere other than where they were supposed to. The Brooks Retreat was a large timber-framed house set back from the lake on a private lot, surrounded by old trees that blocked the road from view. It was well maintained without being showy, the kind of property that communicated money through understatement rather than display. Inside, it was warm and simply furnished, with a long dining table that Ethan immediately claimed as a work surface. By that evening, the table was covered in printed manifests, laptop screens, and handwritten notes. They worked in a rhythm that had developed naturally over the past 2 weeks, Amelia moving through records, identifying anomalies, and flagging them for Caleb to cross-reference against the official digital logs. Olivia tracked the client impact, building a running list of affected contracts and calculating exposure. Ethan moved between all 3 of them, asking questions and making connections that weren't always obvious until he said them out loud. On the second morning, while Caleb and Olivia were on a call with the company's legal team, conducted privately away from the main room, Amelia found herself alone at the table with Ethan for the first time. She was working through a batch of executive summary reports from the previous year, checking them against the warehouse data. The reports were clean, professionally formatted, and almost entirely useless as a reflection of what had actually been happening on the ground. She set one down and picked up the corresponding warehouse manifest beside it, and the gap between the 2 documents was wide enough to be startling. "These reports were prepared for you?" she asked. Ethan glanced over. "Monthly. Senior executives submit them to leadership." "Did you read them?" "Every one." She hesitated, then decided honesty was more useful than diplomacy. "The numbers in these reports and the numbers in the warehouse records don't match on 11 separate points, and these aren't rounding errors. Someone chose what to include and what to leave out." Ethan leaned over to look at the documents she was comparing. He was close enough that she could see the tiredness around his eyes that his posture was working to conceal. "Whoever prepared these reports had access to both sets of data," he said, "and chose to present only one of them," Amelia said. They looked at the same page for a moment without speaking. "How old were you when you took over the company?" Amelia asked. She wasn't sure why she asked it. It came out before she had decided to say it. He didn't seem bothered by the question. 26. My father had a stroke. There wasn't a transition plan." He straightened up and picked up his coffee. "I spent the first 2 years convincing people old enough to be my father that I knew what I was doing." "Did you?" "Sometimes," he said. "Other times I was working it out as I went and hoping nobody noticed." It was more candor than she expected, and it shifted something in the way she was reading him. She had come into this arrangement braced for a version of powerful that she knew well, the kind that kept people slightly off balance on purpose, that traded in small humiliations to maintain distance. Ethan wasn't doing that.
She returned to the reports. By late afternoon, she had found something that made her set her pen down slowly and sit back in her chair. The discrepancies between the executive reports and the warehouse data weren't random. They followed a pattern, and the pattern was consistent with a single reporting source. The same executive submitting monthly reports that consistently understated problems in specific regions, consistently overstated performance in others. The numbers were adjusted just enough to look like honest variation rather than manipulation, and across every single discrepancy, the affected region was the same. She pulled every report from that region over the past 2 years and laid them out in sequence across one end of the table. When Olivia came back into the room and saw them arranged like that, she stopped walking. "What is that?" Olivia asked. "A pattern," Amelia said.
Someone has been managing how this company's leadership sees certain operations. Not stealing, not rerouting money, just controlling the information. Olivia picked up the nearest report and scanned it. Her expression tightened. "These all come from the same regional division." "Yes," Amelia said. "That division reports to Nathan Reed." Amelia had heard the name mentioned twice in passing since she'd started working at the company. A veteran executive, 20 years with Brooks Logistics, someone Ethan trusted in the specific way you trust people who have been part of something since the beginning. She didn't say what she was thinking yet. She just wrote Nathan Reed's name in the margin of her notepad and circled it once. The weekend at Lake Geneva ended on Sunday evening with more questions than answers. Amelia rode back to Chicago in the same seat she'd taken on the way out, watching the road in reverse and thinking about Nathan Reed's name circled in her notepad. She hadn't shared the full weight of what she suspected with anyone yet, partly because suspicion without evidence was just noise, and partly because she understood instinctively that accusing a 20-year veteran of a company on the basis of reporting patterns was the kind of move that could unravel everything if handled carelessly. She needed more before she said anything definitive. What she got instead, 2 days after returning to the office, was a phone call that pulled the entire team in a different direction. Olivia knocked on her office door Tuesday morning with the look of someone managing controlled urgency. A major client based in Dallas, Meridian Freight Partners, one of Brooks Logistics' oldest and most valuable accounts, had submitted a formal notice of contract termination. Their legal team had cited documentation errors in 3 consecutive quarterly shipment reports. Under the terms of the contract, those errors gave Meridian grounds to walk away without penalty. The contract was worth $22 million annually. Ethan was on a call with Meridian's CEO within the hour. By afternoon, the entire team was booked on an early flight to Dallas. They landed the next morning and went directly to Meridian's downtown offices, a glass building that smelled of fresh carpet and corporate confidence. The reception they received was polite in the way that people are polite when they have already made a decision and are simply waiting for the other party to catch up. Meridian's operations director, a precise woman named Sandra Cho, walked them through the disputed reports in a conference room with a view of the skyline. The errors she pointed to were real. Amelia could see that within 10 minutes of looking at the documentation. Shipment confirmation numbers that didn't align with dispatch records, date stamps that were off by enough to create compliance issues under the contract terms. What Sandra Cho didn't know, and what Amelia began to see almost immediately, was that the errors hadn't originated with Brooks Logistics. She asked Sandra for the original confirmation documents that Meridian had received at the time of each shipment. Sandra hesitated. That wasn't a standard request during a contract dispute, but Ethan backed the ask without explanation, and the documents were produced. Amelia spread them across the table beside the disputed reports and started working. The room was quiet. Sandra watched her with open skepticism. Caleb sat to Amelia's left, following her line of reasoning as she traced it, occasionally pulling a document she indicated before she had to ask twice. What she found took 40 minutes to establish and 30 seconds to explain. The confirmation numbers that Meridian had flagged as mismatched were correct in the original dispatch records. At some point between dispatch and the quarterly report compilation, a digit had been transposed in each case. The same type of error repeated across 3 quarters, in a way that looked like clerical carelessness, but was too consistent to be accidental. More importantly, the transpositions followed the same pattern she had already seen in the Milwaukee warehouse data. The same hand, working the same way. These errors weren't made by whoever handled your account, Amelia said, looking at Sandra directly. They were introduced at the reporting stage, after the original records were already correct. Your confirmation numbers are accurate. The quarterly summaries were altered after the fact. Sandra looked at her for a long moment. You're saying someone inside Brooks did this deliberately? I'm saying the original records prove the shipments were handled correctly, Amelia said carefully. What happened to the summaries after that is a separate question. But the grounds for termination aren't supported by the original documentation. The room shifted. Sandra exchanged a look with the attorney sitting beside her that carried an entire conversation in about 2 seconds. The meeting broke for 90 minutes while Meridian's team reviewed what Amelia had laid out. She sat in a side room with Ethan and Caleb, drinking bad coffee and saying very little. Ethan didn't fill the silence with reassurance, which she appreciated. He simply waited, the same way she was waiting, without performing calm. Sandra Cho came back into the room and withdrew the termination notice. The contract stood. On the flight back to Chicago that evening, Caleb fell asleep before they reached cruising altitude. Olivia worked through emails with her headphones in. Ethan sat across the aisle from Amelia, and after a while he leaned over and said quietly, "How did you know where to look?" "The error pattern was the same as what I found in the warehouse records," she said. "Same method, same precision. Whoever did this wasn't being careless. They were being careful in a very specific way. Meaning it's the same person. Meaning it's almost certainly the same person," she said. "And they didn't just touch the Milwaukee records. They've been working across multiple parts of the company. Dallas is a client-facing example. There are probably others." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the last of the daylight was dissolving into a dark horizon. "Nathan Reed's division handles client reporting for 6 of our largest accounts," he said. He wasn't asking a question. "I know," Amelia said. "You've been sitting on that since Lake Geneva." "I've been building a case," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "Fair enough." She turned back to the window. The pattern was becoming clearer with every city they visited, every document she pulled, every discrepancy she traced back to its origin point. But something still didn't fit cleanly. Nathan Reed was experienced enough to do this, certainly. He had access and tenure and the kind of institutional trust that made people stop asking questions. But the method felt wrong for him somehow, and she couldn't yet explain why. She made a note to herself in the margin of her legal pad and stared at it for the rest of the flight. Why go to this much trouble if nothing was stolen? The internal audit request went through Ethan's office directly, bypassing the standard compliance channels entirely. Amelia had suggested it that way, and he had agreed without debate. If someone inside the company was monitoring internal processes, and at this point, the evidence strongly suggested they were, a standard audit request would announce their intentions before they were ready to announce anything. The team flew to Denver on a Wednesday, quiet about the purpose of the trip, even among themselves, until they were off company networks and sitting in a rented conference room in a hotel 3 blocks from the Brooks Logistics regional office. Nathan Reed ran the Denver division. He had been with the company for 22 years, longer than some of the current leadership team had been working professionally. His performance reviews were consistently strong. His client retention numbers were among the best in the company. People liked him in the specific way that people like someone who never causes problems and always shows up prepared. Ethan had known him since childhood. Nathan had worked under Ethan's father before the stroke and had stayed on when Ethan took over, becoming one of the few senior figures who treated the transition with genuine respect rather than thinly veiled skepticism. Amelia understood why accusing him felt almost impossible. She also understood that feelings weren't evidence, and evidence was the only thing that mattered now. She spent the first day in Denver going through Nathan's division records with Caleb, cross-referencing the reporting discrepancies they had already identified against the access logs for the company's internal filing system. Every time a record had been altered, the system logged which user credentials had authorized the change. Nathan Reed's credentials appeared on 41 separate entries. Caleb flagged it immediately. Olivia began drafting a preliminary findings report. The number was damning enough that the conversation in the room shifted without anyone having to say it directly. Amelia didn't move from her chair. She pulled up the access log and looked at the timestamps on each of Nathan's credential entries. Then she pulled his calendar records for the same dates, a request she had quietly made through Ethan before leaving Chicago, without explaining why she needed them specifically. She laid the two documents side by side and went through them line by line. It took her an hour and a half to work through all 41 entries. When she finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "He didn't do it," she said. Caleb looked up from his laptop. "The credentials were used when he wasn't in the building," Amelia said. She turned her notepad around so Caleb could see the comparison she'd made. 37 of these 41 access entries occurred during times when Nathan Reed was either traveling, in client meetings off-site, or recorded on building security as not present. His credentials were used. He wasn't. The room was very quiet. Olivia set down her pen. Someone had his login. Someone who knew his schedule well enough to use his credentials specifically during windows when he had an alibi built in, Amelia said. This wasn't opportunistic. It was planned. Whoever did this chose Nathan's credentials deliberately because he's the one person in this company whose reputation would make the accusation feel credible. She let that sit for a moment. They weren't just manipulating records, she continued. They were building a fallback. If this ever got discovered, the evidence trail leads directly to someone trusted and tenured enough that leadership would find it believable, and devastating enough that it would end his career before anyone looked deeper. Ethan had been standing near the window. He turned around slowly. Nathan was set up. Methodically, Amelia said, over a long period of time. The shift in the room was significant. An hour ago, they had been moving toward a conclusion. Now they were back at the beginning of a different question. Who inside the company had the access, the patience, and the specific knowledge of Nathan Reed's schedule to build this kind of frame around him? Ethan left the hotel room and called Nathan directly. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. When he came back, his expression was composed, but his jaw was tight. He had no idea, Ethan said. I told him his credentials had been used without his knowledge. His first response was to ask how he could help fix it. Amelia had expected that, somehow. The following morning, they went into the Denver regional office with a narrow and specific purpose, not a full audit, not a visible investigation, just Amelia and Caleb walking through the IT infrastructure under the cover of a routine systems review, the kind that happened periodically and generated no particular interest. What they were looking for was the point of entry. How had someone obtained Nathan Reed's credentials and used them without triggering security alerts? The answer came from the IT manager, a quiet man named Greg, who had been with the Denver office for 8 years and was visibly uncomfortable being asked detailed questions about system vulnerabilities. Not guilty uncomfortable, nervous uncomfortable, the kind that comes from realizing something bad happened on your watch. Someone had cloned Nathan's access card 14 months ago. A duplicate had been created through the building's legacy security system, an older infrastructure that logged physical entries separately from the digital network, creating a gap that wasn't cross-referenced automatically. Greg pulled the original cloning record. It had been authorized through the system by a regional operations account. Amelia looked at the account identifier. She wrote it down carefully, checked it twice, and felt the shape of the investigation change completely beneath her. The account didn't belong to Nathan Reed.
It didn't belong to anyone she had suspected. It belonged to someone she had seen in passing twice since joining the team. Someone whose name appeared in the background of reports, whose role sat just below the visibility line of senior leadership, and whose performance numbers, she now recalled, had been consistently exceptional. Suspiciously, quietly, consistently exceptional. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. "We need to go to Seattle," she said. Seattle was raining when they landed, which felt appropriate. Amelia had said very little on the flight about what she'd found in Denver, not because she was being secretive, but because she wanted to be certain before she named anyone. The account identifier she'd copied down pointed to a specific regional operations role, and that role was currently held by a man named Derek Solis. She had seen him twice, once in the hallway outside Ethan's Chicago office during her first week, carrying a tablet and speaking quietly into his phone. Once in the background of a video call during the Dallas preparation, visible for about 30 seconds before someone closed a door. Both times he had made no particular impression, which she now understood was probably deliberate. Derek Solis had been with Brooks Logistics for 9 years. He managed operations across the Pacific Northwest Division, a region that had posted strong performance numbers for 3 consecutive years. His reviews described him as detail-oriented, self-sufficient, and consistently ahead of internal benchmarks. Leadership regarded him as reliable in the specific way that middle-tier executives become reliable, by never drawing attention to themselves and always delivering numbers that made their superiors look good. Amelia had requested his full personnel file from Ethan before boarding the flight. She read it cover to cover at 35,000 feet while the others slept or worked. By the time they landed, she had a theory. She needed the Seattle office records to confirm it. They checked into a hotel near the waterfront and spent the first evening mapping out what they needed and how to access it without alerting anyone in the regional office.
Ethan made 2 calls, one to the company's head of IT security, sworn to silence, and one to a lawyer who had handled sensitive internal matters for Brooks Logistics before. By morning, they had remote access to the Seattle division's raw server data. Amelia sat down with it at 6 in the morning with coffee and worked without stopping until noon. What she found was extensive. Derek Solis had built something over 9 years that was genuinely impressive in its construction, even as everything it contained was a fabrication. He had created a parallel reporting structure, a shadow layer of documentation that sat beneath the official records and fed selectively altered numbers upward into the company's performance summaries. The alterations were never dramatic, a percentage point here, a volume figure adjusted slightly there, small enough to avoid triggering automated variance alerts, consistent enough to compound meaningfully over time. The result was a regional performance record that looked outstanding because Derek had spent years carefully editing out everything that would have made it look ordinary. No money had been taken, no client had been actively harmed, at least not directly. What Derek had done was manufacture a professional reputation using the company's own data infrastructure as his raw material. Every promotion, every positive review, every internal commendation he had received over 9 years was built on numbers he had quietly adjusted to ensure his own success. The missing records, the rerouted manifests, the buried files using Marcus Webb's cipher, all of it connected back to the same purpose. Derek had discovered Marcus's personal coding system through his access to Brooks' subsidiary contracts, and had used it as a structural model for hiding his own alterations. When Marcus died and the records became relevant to the debt acquisition, Derek had moved quickly to obscure the files further, buying himself time. He hadn't anticipated Amelia. She brought the findings to Ethan at noon, spreading printed pages across the hotel room desk in the order she wanted him to read them. He went through everything without interrupting her, which she had come to recognize as his way of processing information he found significant. When he finished, he looked up. 9 years. At minimum, Amelia said. The earliest altered record I can confirm dates back 9 years. There may be earlier instances I haven't reached yet. And the Nathan Reed framing? Derek needed a credible place for the evidence to land if anyone started looking. Nathan had the seniority, the access history, and the trust level to make the accusation stick. Derek spent over a year building that trail deliberately. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the rain had eased into a gray drizzle that blurred the waterfront into soft shapes. He wasn't stealing from the company, Ethan said. No, Amelia said. He was stealing something harder to quantify. Every client his division retained, every internal resource allocated to his region based on performance projections, every decision made about the company's Pacific Northwest strategy, all of it was based on data he controlled and shaped to serve himself. Caleb, who had been listening from across the room, spoke carefully. The operational damage from this is significant. If clients start auditing their own records against what we submitted, they'll find discrepancies, Amelia said, which is why we need to get ahead of it before Derek realizes the investigation has reached Seattle. Ethan nodded. He picked up his phone and made a call to the company's head of security, authorizing a quiet suspension of Derek Solis's system access effective immediately, backdated in the logs to look like routine maintenance, giving no visible indication that anything had changed. Then he called Olivia, who had stayed in Chicago to manage ongoing operations, and told her to begin preparing for a full leadership presentation in New York. He gave her a list of executives who needed to be present, and told her to schedule it for the following week. Is that enough time? Amelia asked after he hung up. It has to be, he said. Derek will notice the access suspension within a few days, regardless of how we disguise it. Once he does, he'll start covering tracks we haven't found yet. Amelia looked at the pages spread across the desk. Months of work, dozens of cities, thousands of documents, all of it converging toward a single presentation in a room full of people who had trusted the wrong numbers for nearly a decade. I'll be ready, she said. She meant it. New York in November felt like the city was bracing for something. Amelia noticed it on the cab ride from the airport, the way the wind moved through the avenues with a particular sharpness, the way pedestrians walked with their shoulders slightly forward, heads down. She had never spent much time in New York. Marcus had come here occasionally for business and never invited her along. She looked out the window and felt, for the first time in months, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The Brooks Logistics New York headquarters occupied 4 floors of a building in Midtown, overlooking a stretch of street that stayed busy regardless of the hour. The main conference room on the executive floor could seat 30 people comfortably. By 9 the following morning, it held 26. Amelia had spent the previous evening in her hotel room finishing the presentation. Caleb had helped her structure the evidence sequence, and Olivia had formatted everything into a clean visual format that could be followed without requiring deep familiarity with logistics documentation. The technical elements were translated into plain language wherever possible. Amelia had insisted on that. The people in that room needed to understand what had happened, not just see charts that confirmed something complicated had occurred. She hadn't slept much. Not from anxiety exactly, more from the particular alertness that comes when something you've been working toward for a long time is finally arriving. Ethan opened the meeting at 9:15. He introduced Amelia to the assembled executive simply, without embellishment. She had been brought in to assist with a records recovery effort, and what she had found in the course of that work required the attention of everyone in the room. He said it calmly, without signaling the weight of what was coming, and then he sat down and gave her the floor. She stood at the head of the table and looked at the room for a moment before beginning. 26 faces looked back at her. Some curious, some impatient, a few with the careful blankness of people who had learned to withhold reaction until they understood which direction things were moving. She recognized the dynamic. She had spent years in rooms where her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. This was different. She had earned the right to be standing here, and she knew it. She started from the beginning. She walked them through Marcus Webb's cipher system and the buried records, explaining how the files had been hidden rather than deleted, and how she had identified the decoding structure. She moved through the Milwaukee warehouse findings, the Dallas contract discrepancies, the Denver credential cloning, and the Seattle shadow reporting network. Each element connected to the next in a sequence that built its own momentum. By the time she reached Derek Solis's name, the room was completely still. She had deliberately placed his name 2/3 of the way through the presentation, rather than at the beginning. She wanted the evidence to arrive before the conclusion, so that when the name appeared, it felt inevitable rather than accusatory. A jury needed to understand the crime before they could accept the verdict. The evidence was thorough. 9 years of altered records, reconstructed and laid against the originals. The credential cloning trail leading from Denver back to a Seattle authorization. The shadow documentation structure mapped across 4 regional divisions. The deliberate construction of a false evidence trail pointing toward Nathan Reed, detailed carefully enough that the room could follow exactly how it had been done and why. When she finished, she set down the presentation remote and waited. The silence lasted about 4 seconds, which in a room of 26 executives felt considerably longer. Then the questions came, and they came quickly. Amelia answered each one directly, referring back to specific documents when challenged, acknowledging the 2 instances where the evidence was strong, but not yet complete. She didn't overstate what she knew. That restraint, she could see, landed differently than confident overreach would have. Halfway through the questions, the door at the far end of the room opened. Derek Solis walked in. He had been invited to the meeting under the pretense of a routine regional operations review, Ethan's decision, made deliberately. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room, and Amelia watched the precise moment when he understood what was on the screens behind her. His expression didn't collapse. He was too controlled for that. But something behind his eyes recalibrated, and the slight forward motion he'd carried into the room stopped completely. Ethan spoke from his seat without raising his voice. "Derek, please sit down." He sat. He listened to the remainder of the presentation without speaking. When Amelia concluded, Ethan turned to the company's general counsel, who had been present and taking notes throughout, and asked her to outline the next steps. The counsel spoke for 6 minutes about the formal process that would follow: the independent review, the documentation of findings, the client notification protocol. Derek Solis resigned before the meeting ended. He passed a folded note to the general counsel, stood, and left the room without making eye contact with anyone. The room watched him go with the particular quiet of people processing something they hadn't expected to see in person. After he left, the conversation shifted to recovery. Amelia walked the group through the reconstruction plan, how the corrected records would be reintegrated into the system, which clients needed direct outreach, and how the operational gaps created by 9 years of false reporting could be addressed methodically over the following months. She had prepared for this part too. The exposure of the problem was only useful if it came with a path forward. By early afternoon, the meeting had moved from shock to planning. Executives who had looked at her with polite skepticism that morning were now directing questions to her specifically, taking notes on her answers. Ethan caught her eye across the table at one point and held it for just a moment. She looked back at him steadily, then returned to the work. There was still plenty left to do. Nantucket in late December was quiet in the way that places are quiet when the season has emptied them of everyone who only comes for the good weather. The streets near the harbor held a handful of year-round residents, a few shops with lights on, and the kind of stillness that feels earned rather than empty. Amelia had never been to Nantucket. She had never been to most of the places this journey had taken her, which struck her as something worth thinking about as the car from the airport moved through the narrow roads toward the coast. The Brooks Company retreat here was smaller than the Lake Geneva property, a weathered shingle house set on a bluff above the water, surrounded by tall grass that moved constantly in the ocean wind. It felt less like a corporate facility and more like somewhere a person actually lived, which Ethan confirmed when he met them at the door and mentioned that his grandmother had owned it before the company acquired it from the estate. The gathering was smaller than New York. 8 people, including Amelia, Caleb, Olivia, and a few senior executives she had come to know over the past months. The stated purpose was a leadership transition meeting. The company was restructuring several divisions in the wake of everything that had been uncovered, and decisions needed to be made about what the next phase looked like. The first day was largely logistical. Olivia ran most of it, moving through a recovery timeline with the efficiency that Amelia had come to recognize as her natural state. The client outreach program was underway, and early responses were better than anticipated. 3 of the 6 largest affected accounts had already confirmed they were staying. The corrected records had been reintegrated into the system cleanly, using the reconstruction framework Amelia had built during the New York presentation. The debt attached to Marcus Webb's estate had been formally resolved 2 weeks earlier. Ethan's legal team had structured a settlement that cleared the outstanding balance against the value of the work Amelia had performed. A clean accounting that left her with no remaining obligations and a modest financial settlement on top. She was, for the first time in her adult life, entirely free of something. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that feeling, so she carried it quietly and let it settle at its own pace. On the second morning, she woke before the others and walked down to the water alone. The path from the house to the beach was steep and narrow, cut into the bluff through years of use, and at the bottom it opened onto a stretch of pale sand that the tide had smoothed overnight. The ocean was gray and wide and completely indifferent to her presence, which she found oddly comforting. She stood at the edge of the water for a long time. She thought about the woman who had sat in a parking garage 3 months ago, talking herself into walking through a glass door. She thought about the kitchen table covered in debt letters and the lawyer's careful expression, and the 6 minutes she had spent in her car on Michigan Avenue deciding whether to go inside. She thought about Marcus, too, not with grief, but with the particular clarity that comes when enough time has passed to see a person as they actually were, rather than as the space they occupied in your life. He had been careless with her in ways she had spent years excusing. But he had also, entirely without meaning to, left her with something useful. She had paid attention when he wasn't watching, and that attention had turned out to matter. She heard footsteps on the path behind her and turned to find Ethan making his way down to the beach, carrying 2 cups of coffee with the careful focus of someone navigating a steep slope while trying not to spill anything. He handed her one without ceremony and stood beside her, looking at the water. They were quiet for a while, which had become comfortable between them in the way that silence becomes comfortable when 2 people have spent enough time working through difficult things together. "The board approved the new division yesterday," he said eventually. "Records modernization and data integrity. It's a permanent function, not a project. The company should have built it years ago." Amelia wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Who are you planning to put in charge of it?" He looked at her sideways. "I was hoping that was an obvious answer by now." She had known it was coming. Olivia had mentioned it obliquely twice during the New York meetings, and Caleb had said something even less subtle on the flight to Nantucket. She had let herself think about it without fully committing to a response, the way you keep a door slightly open without deciding whether to walk through it. "It would mean relocating to Chicago full-time," she said. "Yes." "And working with your team on a permanent basis." "Also yes." She looked back at the ocean. A line of birds moved across the horizon in loose formation, heading somewhere with the easy certainty of things that always know where they're going. "When Marcus died," she said, "I thought the best I could hope for was getting through it without losing everything. The house, the finances, some version of a stable life." She paused. "I didn't imagine any of this." "Neither did I," Ethan said. He said it simply, without loading it with more than it held, and she appreciated that. She took a slow breath of cold, salt air. "I'll take the position," she said. He nodded, looking out at the water. "There's a lot of work ahead," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not worried about that." And she meant it, completely, without the performance of confidence that had carried her through the early weeks of this. The worry that had been her constant companion since those first debt letters arrived had shifted into something that felt steadier and quieter and entirely her own. She finished her coffee looking at the ocean, standing on solid ground. The story ended there, on a cold beach in December, with Amelia Webb knowing exactly who she was and precisely where she was going next.